So let's first understand this idea of Islamic banking, which many of us are probably not familiar with in the Western world. Under Judaism and Christianity, usury is forbidden. That is, the charging of interest. Interest and usury were not distinguished from each other in ancient times, in the period in which these religious texts were originally authored. In fact, the context of the expressions amounts to no more than to say to loan for not only the principal but for more. In other words, the very words which might be used might be and more. That is, to ask for more in return than that which you may have lent. And of course, in the case of promissory obligations, we are not even talking about lending. We are actually considering the human right instead to issue a promissory obligation to pay for a thing that we consume as we consume of it. So these are distinct ideas which nonetheless the ancient religious texts of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam altogether nonetheless pertain. In Islam, both the giving and taking of riba, or interest, are forbidden. So how does all this sort out? Of course, this idea of usury or interest, original idea of usury, was obfuscated in the Western world in the advent of the imposition of central banks upon the world, during which the traditional definition of usury, to charge interest, was expanded upon to say that interest was a distinct, separate, and morally authorizable thing, as if it had some different consequences. That is, in the definitions of the dictionaries of modern English, interest is defined to be an ostensibly permissible or legal rate of interest, whereas usury is any rate of interest which is above that. Long ago, in the very beginning of all this, I questioned what that process could possibly be that would ostensibly distinguish interest from usury. And I determined that there was none, and this is why I wrote this paper, Interest is Usury, which is so plagiarized. Many of my contending theorists have even borrowed the title of the paper, weeded it out of certain things which would invalidate their proposition of solution, and have purported that an ostensible precious metal monetary standard might save us. But the idea of this paper is that any rate of interest which requires reborrowing interest in order to maintain a vital circulation is inherently usurious, because it inherently and irreversibly, and therefore terminally, multiplies artificial indebtedness in proportion to a circulation or remaining capacity to pay. That is, any rate of interest is usurious because, by definition, because it inevitably engenders usurious sums of debt, which is the very definition of usury still to this day. A very similar thing has occurred in regard to Islam, in my estimation, of this purported system of purportedly Islamic banking. That is, much as the Western world obfuscated the definition of the term usury into a subclass of interest which was ostensibly permissible, but yet, of course, which results in the same consequence over simply a somewhat longer period of time. That is, interest, any rate of interest, which at all requires reborrowing to maintain a vital circulation, inherently multiplies unwarranted dispossession until the subjects, the unwitting subjects of the system, are dispossessed of everything. A similar thing happens in Islam, and of course, or in the Muslim world, under this concept of Islamic banking, where the word riba, which equates to interest in original biblical terms as we would understand it here in the Western world. This idea of Islamic banking is served by an obfuscation of riba, or interest, to rent. That is, a different name for what is charged in addition to what is to be repaid back is applied to this implementation of Islamic banking, ostensibly or purportedly to justify Islamic banking in what is called Islamic banking in the Islamic world. Is it true that this is justified because what we call more that is charged rent instead of riba? Of course, no reasonable person, I think, would think so. But the consequence of this thing, which is simply called rent, and is imposed in, albeit somewhat different ways, in Islamic banking. This concept of rent has the same ramification of interest or usury in the Western world, because you have a limited circulation, and it is subject to this implicit obligation to maintain the circulation so long as the rent, quote unquote, can be paid by reborrowing the principal and rent that you pay out of the circulation as a new debt equal to the former debt plus rent. So, in truth, it is no different. And if it resolved the issues which are imposed by interest, usury, or riba, or rent, if it resolved the improprieties which are imposed by interest, usury, riba, or rent, then, of course, we might assume that the Muslim world would be free to prosper, each and every one of us, as we would be under mathematically perfected economy if, likewise, we rectified the same faults and injustices of interest or usury. So, all we have, in truth, is different terms applying to a like process, engendering like faults, which in fact are even terminal. And, of course, all this would require to model this out with the same models that I provided the Reagan administration would be to, assume that changing the titles of the data meant anything different. So, in truth, Islamic banking does not fulfill the objects of religious teaching as interest or usury cannot fulfill the objects of religious teaching as taught in any one of these three major religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So there are further problems in Islamic banking, and I'm not, although I have studied this, the explanations of Islamic banking, that it's much like, it's probably not as bad as wading through the material that ostensibly explains how the Federal Reserve System works. But likewise, from studying Islamic banking, even on a cursory level, you can see it has certain other faults, a mere handful of which are sufficient to make it very adverse to sustaining the prosperity of the people, or monetary justice, and of course, hopefully, the principal object of religion is truth and justice. So, in effect, Islamic banking is adverse to fulfilling these objects of religion, as is a central banking system to Christianity and Judaism. The principal further problem that I have with Islamic banking is that it doesn't sustain a volume of circulation which is commensurable with sustaining all possible prosperity. That is, as I've explained in earlier programs, in this example where we have 1,000 people in a circle, and each one, turns to their left at the end of a period of time and exchanges their production to the person on their left for 10 units of currency. Well, if we remove some of this circulation from every fifth person in this circle, we see what happens when we attempt to conduct this immediate conveyance of all production, and the result of the fact that this transaction is extremely impeded at every fifth person that we deprive of, say, 5 units of circulation. The result of this is ultimately a consequence of denying people just reward for their production. And the only way that you can actually give them whatever they determine themselves in truly free markets to be just reward for their production is by monetizing their production to whatever is determined to be the value by the person who agrees to purchase and consume of it, if any. Otherwise, of course, no circulation is even required to represent that wealth. So, in fact, then, in denying every fifth person in our example of 5 units of circulation, the reason that this former capacity of being able to sustain an immediate trade of all production, the reason that we can't do that is because people have been denied of just reward. So, like the central banking systems which have been imposed upon the world deny this opportunity to the subject republics upon which these central banking systems have been imposed. The reason that Islamic banking suffers the same problem is likewise. It does not monetize all production by restoring to the people their right to issue promissory obligations, free of exploitation or rent. In this case, what is merely called rent. So there's really very little meaningful difference at all, if any, between Islamic banking and the central banks which have been imposed upon the world. And frankly, I assert that a particularly relevant evidence of the fact that this is imposed for the same kind of motives and objects as a central banking system